The flames roared higher than Jake Morrison had ever seen, orange tongues licking at the Montana sky as his prize barn crumbled before his eyes. But it wasn't the loss of his livelihood that made his heart stop. It was the desperate scream echoing from inside the inferno, a voice that somehow felt familiar despite 10 years of silence. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning had started like any other on the Double M Ranch. Jake Morrison pulled on his worn leather boots at 5:30 a.m. sharp, the same ritual he'd followed for the past decade since taking over his grandfather's spread in Willow Creek, Montana. The coffee was strong, black as the pre-dawn sky, and the silence of the house wrapped around him like an old friend. At 32, Jake had grown comfortable with solitude. The ranch hands would arrive by 7, but these early hours belonged to him alone, time to check the weather, plan the day's work, and pretend he wasn't thinking about the empty space beside him at the breakfast table. The Double M stretched across 1,500 acres of prime grazing land, nestled between the Crazy Mountains and the Yellowstone River. Jake's grandfather, Magnus Morrison, had built it from nothing after World War II, and 3 generations of Morrisons had poured their blood, sweat, and dreams into every fence post and water trough. Jake intended to keep it that way, even if he'd be the last Morrison to do so. He stepped onto the wraparound porch, breathing in the crisp October air. The aspens were turning gold, their leaves shimmering like coins in the gentle breeze. Cattle dotted the distant pastures, dark shapes against the amber grass. It was picture-perfect ranch country, the kind that drew photographers and tourists from back east, all of them wanting to capture something authentic before returning to their concrete jungles. Jake's border collie, Rex, bounded up the porch, steps, tail wagging with the enthusiasm of youth. The dog was barely 2 years old, a replacement for Old Blue, who'd passed the previous winter. Rex was eager to please, but lacked Blue's instinctive understanding of cattle work. Everything took time, Jake reminded himself, scratching behind the dog's ears. Morning, boy, ready to earn your keep. The barn stood about 200 yards from the main house, a massive structure built from local pine and painted the traditional, a red that seemed to glow in the early light. It housed Jake's prize breeding stock, 20 head of Black Angus that represented years of careful selection and considerable investment. The barn also contained his equipment, feed supplies, and workshop. It was the heart of the operation. Jake's hired help began trickling in around 7. Tommy Hendricks arrived first, as always, driving his battered Ford pickup that had seen better decades. Tommy was pushing 60, a leathery cowboy who'd worked ranches across Montana before settling at the Double M 5 years ago. He was reliable, experienced, and asked no questions about Jake's past, qualities Jake valued above all else. "Morning, boss," Tommy called out, adjusting his faded hat. "Saw the weather report. Storm front is moving in this afternoon." "How bad?" "Could be nasty. High winds, maybe some hail. Might want to get the stock moved to the lower pasture." Jake nodded. October storms in Montana could be brutal, and the upper pasture was too exposed for comfort. "We'll start after breakfast. Get Carlos and Miguel to help." Carlos Ramirez and Miguel Santos arrived together, both in their 30s, both excellent horsemen who'd come north from Texas following work. They spoke limited English, but they understood cattle better than most men understood their own wives. Jake had learned enough Spanish over the years to communicate the basics, and respect filled in the gaps where language failed. The morning routine unfolded with practiced efficiency. Feed the breeding stock, check water lines, inspect fencing, and move the main herd to safer ground before the storm hit. Jake worked alongside his men, never asking them to do anything he wouldn't do himself. It was a lesson his grandfather had drilled into him. A good boss leads by example. By noon, dark clouds were building on the western horizon. The wind had picked up, carrying the scent of rain and something else, an electric tension that made the horses skittish and the cattle restless. Rex stayed close to Jake's heels, sensing the approaching storm. "Better call it early today," Jake told his crew as they gathered for lunch at the main house. "Get your families secured. This one looks like it might be a howler." Tommy squinted at the sky. "You sure you don't want us to stick around, help you with the barn stock? I can handle it. You boys get home." The three men packed up their gear and headed out, Tommy's truck disappearing down the gravel road that led to the county highway. Carlos and Miguel lived in a small bunkhouse on the far side of the property, but they'd already made plans to stay with friends in town until the storm passed. Jake was alone again, the way he preferred it when trouble was brewing. The storm hit. At 4 o'clock with the fury of a living thing. Wind howled across the open range, bending grass flat and rattling every window in the house. Rain came in sheets, then turned to marble-sized hail that drummed against the metal roof like machine. Gunfire! Jake stood at his kitchen window, watching nature's violence unfold across his land. He'd weathered plenty of storms over the years, but this one felt different, more personal somehow, as if the sky itself had a grudge against the Double M Ranch. Lightning split the darkness, illuminating the landscape in stark black and white snapshots. Thunder followed seconds later, shaking the house to its foundation. Through it all, Jake thought about the stock in the barn. 20 head of prime breeding cattle, worth more than most people made in a year. They'd be safe enough in the sturdy structure his grandfather had built. But storms made animals nervous, and nervous animals could hurt themselves trying to escape imaginary dangers. The power went out at 5:30, plunging the house into premature darkness. Jake lit a kerosene lantern and settled in to wait. The battery-powered radio crackled with weather warnings and reports of damage across the county. Trees down, power lines snapped, roads flooded. It would be a long night for everyone in Willow. Greek! Around 7 o'clock, during a brief lull in the storm, Jake heard something that made his blood run cold. It started as a distant crackling, like bacon frying in a cast-iron pan. Then came the unmistakable roar of flames consuming dry wood. He grabbed his flashlight and rushed to the window. Orange light flickered in the direction of the barn, growing brighter with each passing second. Lightning must have struck during one of the violent bursts, probably hitting the metal weather vane his grandfather had installed on the peak of the roof. Jake pulled on his boots and heavy coat, mind racing through emergency procedures. The cattle would be panicking, trapped in their stalls, with smoke filling the air. He had maybe minutes to get them out before the whole structure became a death trap. He burst out the front door into the teeth of the storm. Rain and hail pelted his face as he ran toward the burning barn, flashlight beam dancing wildly in front of him. The wind tried to knock him down, but Jake pressed forward, driven by the desperate lowing of terrified animals. The barn was fully engulfed by the time he reached it. Flames shot through the roof, and black smoke poured from every opening. The heat was intense, even from 50 feet away. Jake knew immediately that the building was lost, but he might still save the stock if he could get the doors open. He reached the main entrance and grabbed the heavy wooden bar that secured it. The metal was already hot to the touch, but Jake ignored the pain and lifted it clear. The doors swung open, and a wall of superheated air hit him like a physical blow. Through the smoke and flames, he could see the cattle milling in confusion. Some had already broken free of their stalls and were pressed against the far wall, looking for escape. Jake whistled sharply, the sound cutting through the chaos, and several animals turned toward the open doors. "Come on!" he shouted, waving his arms. This way. The first few cattle needed no encouragement. They bolted past Jake into the storm, choosing the familiar discomfort of wind and rain over the terror of fire. Others followed, but several remained trapped in the back stalls, either too frightened to move or unable to break free of their restraints. Jake took a deep breath and plunged into the inferno. The smoke was thick as soup, burning his eyes and throat. He pulled his shirt up over his nose and mouth, trying to filter the worst of it, but every breath was agony. The heat was overwhelming, like standing inside an oven. Somewhere in the roaring chaos, he could hear the groaning of stressed timber. As the barn's skeleton began to fail, he reached the first trapped animal, a young bull worth $10,000, and quickly released the gate latch. The bull needed no invitation. It charged past Jake toward the doors, knocking him sideways in its panic. Jake stumbled, but kept moving, muscle memory guiding him through the barn he'd known since childhood. 2 more cattle freed. Then 3. The smoke was getting thicker, making it nearly impossible to see. Jake's lungs burned with each breath, and he could feel the hair on his arms singeing from the heat. The roof groaned ominously overhead, and he knew he was running out of time. That's when he heard it, the scream that would change everything. It came from the back corner of the barn, where Jake stored equipment and supplies. Not the bellow of a panicked animal, but the distinctly human cry of someone in mortal terror. A woman's voice, high and desperate, cutting through the roar of flames like a knife through silk. Jake's rational mind told him it was impossible. No one else was supposed to be here. The hired hands had gone home, and the nearest neighbors were miles away. But the scream came again, weaker this time, and Jake found himself moving toward the sound before conscious thought could stop him. He pushed deeper into the burning barn, past the empty stalls where his cattle had been, toward the storage area he rarely visited during storms. The heat was unbearable now, and falling debris singed his clothes. Each step was a gamble against the weakening structure overhead. Through the smoke he glimpsed a figure huddled near the far wall. A woman in dark clothing, crouched behind some equipment, trying to shield herself from the flames. Her long hair covered her face, but something about her posture, her size, struck a chord of recognition that Jake couldn't quite place. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "Hey!" he shouted over the roar. "This way!" She looked up at the sound of his voice, and even through the smoke and flickering light, Jake saw her eyes, green as spring grass, wide with terror, and something else. Recognition. Impossible, but the feeling hit him like a physical blow. Reached her in 3 quick strides, not allowing himself to think about the impossibility of the situation. The roof could collapse at any moment, and questions would have to wait until they were both clear of the inferno. "Can you walk?" he asked. Kneeling beside her, she nodded but seemed unable to speak. Up close, Jake could see she was young, maybe mid-20s, with delicate features smudged with soot and dirt. Her clothes were torn, and there was blood on her hands from trying to clear debris. Jake didn't hesitate. He scooped her up in his arms, surprised by how light she felt, and turned back toward what he hoped were the doors. The smoke was so thick now that visibility was measured in inches rather than feet. He moved by instinct and memory, each step a prayer that the floor would hold and the ceiling wouldn't choose that moment to fall. Behind them, something massive crashed to the ground, probably one of the main support beams. The woman in his arms made a small sound of fear and pressed closer to his chest. Jake could feel her heart beating against his ribs, rapid as a bird's wing. "Almost there," he whispered, though he wasn't sure if he was reassuring her or himself. The doors appeared, out of the smoke like a miracle, framing a rectangle of storm-torn sky that looked beautiful by comparison. Jake stumbled through the opening just as another section of roof collapsed behind them, sending a shower of sparks into the night. He carried the woman a safe distance from the burning barn before setting her down gently on the wet grass. Rain immediately began washing the soot from both their faces, and Jake got his first clear look at the person he'd just rescued. She was beautiful, even disheveled and frightened as she was. Dark hair fell in waves past her shoulders, and those Impossible green eyes looked up at him with an expression he couldn't read. There was something familiar about her face, something that tugged at memories Jake had spent years trying to forget. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice rough from smoke. Inhalation. She shook her head, still not speaking. Her eyes never left his face, as if she were studying him, trying to solve some puzzle. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Jake?" The name hit him like lightning, not Mr. or Sir, or even a tentative question about his identity. Just Jake, spoken with the kind of familiarity that comes from intimate knowledge. Jake stared at her, his mind racing through possibilities, rejecting each one as impossible. "Do I know you?" he asked, though something deep inside already suspected the answer would turn his world upside down. She struggled to sit up, wincing, as she moved. "It's me," she said softly. "It's Sarah." The name hung in the air between them like a physical thing. Sarah. Jake's mouth went dry, and he felt the ground shift beneath him. It couldn't be. Sarah was gone, had been gone for 10 years, vanished from his life as completely as if she'd never existed. But those eyes, that voice, the way she said his name, Sarah Mitchell. The words came out as a croak. She nodded, tears mixing with the rain on her cheeks. "Sarah Morrison, actually, or I was supposed to be." Jake sat back hard, the shock hitting him like another lightning bolt. Sarah Morrison, his bride, the woman who was supposed to become his wife 10 years ago, before everything went wrong, before the wedding that never happened, before she disappeared from Willow Creek and left him to pick up the pieces of his shattered life. The barn continued to burn behind them, painting the sky in shades of orange and red, but Jake barely noticed. His entire world had just shifted on its axis, and he was still trying to understand how the woman he'd loved and lost had suddenly materialized in his burning barn like some kind of ghost made flesh. "That's impossible," he said finally. "You're dead." The rain had softened to a gentle drizzle by the time Jake helped Sarah to the main house, his arm supporting her weight as she limped across the muddy yard. The barn had collapsed completely, leaving only a smoldering pile of charred timber and twisted metal where his livelihood had stood just hours before. But the financial loss felt insignificant compared to the impossibility of the woman leaning against his shoulder. Sarah Mitchell, or Morrison as she'd claimed, was supposed to be buried in Willow Creek Cemetery. Jake had stood at her graveside 10 years ago, watching them lower an empty coffin into Montana soil while her parents wept beside him. The authorities had declared her dead after the car accident, even though they'd never found her body in the Yellowstone River. The current was strong that spring, they'd said. Bodies sometimes traveled for miles before washing ashore, if they ever did. Inside the house, Jake settled Sarah onto his leather couch and built up the fire in the stone hearth. She sat quietly, staring at the flames with those green eyes he'd once known better than his own reflection. Her dark hair was still damp from the rain, and she'd wrapped herself in the wool blanket he'd given her, but she couldn't seem to stop shivering. "I'll make coffee," Jake said, needing something to do with his hands. The silence between them felt dangerous, loaded with 10 years of unanswered questions. While the coffee brewed, he studied her from the kitchen. She looked older, naturally, but there were lines around her eyes that spoke of more than just the passage of time. She was thinner than he remembered, and there was a wariness about her that hadn't existed in the girl he'd fallen in love with. Whatever had happened to Sarah Mitchell in the past decade, it hadn't been kind. He returned with 2 steaming mugs, handing her one before settling into the chair across from the couch. Rex had claimed his usual spot by the fire, but even the dog seemed to sense the tension in the room. His ears twitched at every sound, and he kept glancing between Jake and the stranger on the couch. "Start talking," Jake said finally. "And don't give me any fairy tales. I buried you, Sarah. I stood there and watched them put a headstone with your name on it, Sarah wrapped her fingers around the mug, using its warmth to steady herself. When she looked up, her eyes held a pain so deep it made Jake's chest tighten. Despite his anger, "They told me you were dead too," she whispered. "They said the whole thing was staged, that everyone I knew thought I was gone. It was easier to let them believe it." "Who's they?" Sarah closed her eyes, and Jake saw her hands tremble slightly. "My father. His people. Men who make problems disappear for the right price." Jake set down his coffee with deliberate care, fighting the urge to shake the truth out of her. "Your father is a rancher, Sarah. Bill Mitchell raises cattle and grows hay. He doesn't have people." "That's what everyone in Willow Creek thinks." Sarah's voice was barely audible. "That's what I thought, too, until I started asking the wrong questions." She pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders and began to speak, her voice gaining strength as the story unfolded. Jake listened without interruption, though every word felt like another nail in the coffin of the life he thought he'd known. "Bill Mitchell wasn't just a rancher," Sarah explained. "He was a front man for a sophisticated money-laundering operation that moved drug profits through legitimate agricultural businesses across Montana and Wyoming. The Mitchell Ranch was clean on the surface, but underneath it served as a way station for millions of dollars in dirty money. Cattle sales, equipment purchases, land deals, all of it carefully orchestrated to scrub blood money until it came out the other side looking like honest profit." Sarah had discovered the truth by accident. 3 weeks before their wedding, she'd been helping her father with the books, preparing for the audit that always preceded their annual loan renewal. The numbers hadn't made sense, too much cash flowing through accounts that should have shown modest ranch income. When she'd asked about it, her father had brushed off her concerns, told her not to worry about details that didn't concern her. But Sarah had always been curious, always needed to understand how things worked. She dug deeper, following paper trails that led to shell companies and offshore accounts. She'd found records of meetings with men who had no business on a cattle ranch, payments that corresponded to no legitimate transactions. And finally, she'd discovered her father's real employers, a cartel that had been using rural Montana as a pipeline for their American operations. "I was scared," Sarah said, her voice breaking slightly. "But I was also stupid. I thought I could convince him to stop, to get out before it was too late. I confronted him the night before our wedding." Jake remembered that night. Sarah had seemed nervous at the rehearsal dinner, distracted and jumpy. He'd attributed it to normal pre-wedding jitters, had even teased her about getting cold feet. If only he'd known what was really troubling her. "He tried to explain it away at first," Sarah continued. "Said it was just business, that everyone in agriculture had to make compromises to survive. But when I told him I was going to the FBI, everything changed. He got this look in his eyes, like I'd become a stranger to him, like I was a problem that needed to be solved. The plan, as Sarah described it, was elegant in its simplicity, a staged car accident on the winding road above the Yellowstone River. Sarah's body would disappear into the current, giving the authorities a neat explanation for her death while eliminating the threat she posed to the operation. Her father had contacts who specialized in making inconvenient people vanish, men who could arrange accidents that looked convincingly real. But something had gone wrong with the execution. The crash had been real enough, and Sarah had been injured when her car went off the road. But instead of dying as planned, she'd been pulled from the wreckage by the very men who were supposed to kill her. One of them, a cartel enforcer named Martinez, had made a different decision in that crucial moment. "He had a daughter my age," Sarah said quietly. "Back in Mexico. He looked at me lying there in the river mud, bleeding and broken, and he couldn't do it. Instead of finishing the job, he got me to a doctor, someone who didn't ask questions. They patched me up and gave me a choice. The choice was simple: disappear completely and stay disappeared, or die for real." Martinez had arranged new identity documents, a small amount of cash, and transportation to a city where no one would look for Sarah Mitchell. In exchange, she had to swear never to contact anyone from her old life, never to return to Montana, and never to speak about what she'd learned regarding her father's business. I spent the first year in Denver working in a hotel kitchen under the name Lisa Coleman. Every day I wanted to call you, to let you know I was alive, but Martinez had made it clear that breaking the deal would mean death for both of us. So, I kept quiet and tried to build a new life. Jake stood up abruptly, pacing to the window where he could see the smoldering remains of his barn. The financial implications were staggering. 20 head of prize cattle, years of equipment, and the building itself. Insurance would cover some of it, but not nearly enough to rebuild quickly. The Double M Ranch was facing a crisis that threatened its very survival. But even that catastrophe paled beside the revelation that the woman he'd mourned for 10 years had been living under an assumed name in Denver while he'd struggled to piece together a life without her. "Why now?" he asked without turning around. "Why are you here, Sarah? What changed?" "Martinez died 3 months ago. Heart attack. The other men who knew about the deal are either dead or in prison. My father—" She paused, and Jake heard her, set down her coffee mug. "My father died last spring. Cancer." Jake turned back to face her. Bill Mitchell's death had been big news in Willow Creek. The man had been a pillar of the community, a deacon in the Baptist church, a volunteer firefighter. For 30 years, his funeral had drawn hundreds of mourners from across the county. Jake had even attended, paying his respects to the father of the woman he'd once planned to marry. "With him gone, the protection was gone too," Sarah continued. "The new people running things didn't know about our arrangement. They started looking for loose ends, people who might know too much about the old operations. Someone remembered there was a daughter who died under suspicious circumstances, and they began to wonder if I was really dead. So you ran. I had too. They found where I was living in Denver, came to my apartment asking questions. I barely got out ahead of them." Sarah's voice turned bitter. 10 years of keeping my mouth shut. 10 years of being Lisa Coleman, and it still wasn't enough. They wanted to be sure. Jake sat back down, his mind reeling. "And you came here because I didn't have anywhere else to go. Because I thought maybe, after all these years, there might still be someone in the world who remembered. Sarah Mitchell with something other than pity or hatred. Your mother, remarried 2 years ago, lives in Florida with her new husband. She's built a life that doesn't include a dead daughter, and I can't blame her for that." Sarah's smile was heartbreaking. "I've been watching from a distance for months, Jake, learning about what happened after I disappeared. Your parents moved to Arizona. Your sister got married and lives in Seattle. You're the only one left who knew me before." "The only one left. Who loved you, you mean?" The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Sarah's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't look away. "I know I have no right to ask anything of you," she said. "I know what my disappearance did to you, how it changed your life, but I was hoping maybe we could find a way past it." Jake laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "Find a way past it? Sarah, do you have any idea what the last 10 years have been like? Do you know what it's like to plan a future with someone and then watch it all disappear in a single night?" No, it wasn't fair." "Fair?" Jake stood again, anger finally breaking through the shock. "Fair doesn't begin to cover it. I spent months searching for you after the accident. I hired private investigators, offered rewards, followed every false lead and dead-end tip. I couldn't accept that you were really gone because something about the whole thing felt wrong." Sarah's face crumpled. "Jake, I wanted to tell you, but you didn't. You chose to let me believe you were dead, rather than trust me with the truth. You chose to protect yourself and let me suffer. I was protecting both of us. If I had contacted you, they would have killed you too. Don't you understand that? What I understand is that you made a decision to cut me out of your life completely. No phone call, no letter, no sign that the woman I was going to marry even remembered I existed. Jake walked to the mantelpiece, staring at the family photos arranged there. His grandfather, his parents, his sister, all the people who'd shaped his life. Conspicuously absent was any picture of Sarah, though there had been dozens once upon a time. He'd burned them all in the months after her supposed death, unable to bear the constant reminder of what he'd lost. "I never stopped thinking about you," Sarah said quietly. "Not a single day went by when I didn't wonder what you were doing, whether you were happy, whether you'd found someone else." "Did I?" Jake asked without turning around. "Find someone else?" The question hung in the air for a long moment before Sarah answered. "No. You became exactly what everyone expected, the confirmed bachelor rancher who threw himself into his work and avoided any serious relationships. There were women, but none who lasted more than a few months." Jake felt a chill. "That had nothing to do with the October weather. You've been watching me." "Not like that. I hired someone to check on you occasionally just to make sure you were safe, to make sure my father's people hadn't decided you knew too much." "Jesus, Sarah." Jake turned back to face her, seeing her clearly for the first time since he'd carried her from the burning barn. This wasn't the naive girl he'd fallen in love with. This was a woman who'd spent 10 years living in the shadows, making hard choices and compromising her principles just to survive. "What happened to you?" "I grew up," she said simply. "I learned that the world is a much darker place than we believed when we were 22 and planning a fairy tale wedding." Jake studied her face, looking for traces of the woman he'd once known. They were there, buried beneath the wariness and the premature lines of worry, but the girl who'd laughed at his jokes and dreamed of raising children on the Double M Ranch was gone forever. "The barn," Sarah said suddenly. "The fire. That wasn't an accident, was it?" Jake felt his stomach drop. He'd been so focused on Sarah's revelation that he hadn't considered the implications of her sudden appearance. "You think they followed you here? Lightning doesn't usually start fires in metal-roofed barns, especially during rainstorms." Sarah's voice was steady, but Jake could see the fear in her eyes. "They found me, Jake, and now they know about you." Through the window, Jake could see the first hints of dawn on the eastern horizon. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world washed clean but forever changed. Somewhere out there, men who made their living eliminating problems were probably already planning their next move. The Double M Ranch, Jake's sanctuary for the past 10 years, had become a target. "We need to call the sheriff," Jake said. "And tell him what? That a dead woman showed up in your barn just before it mysteriously caught fire, that my father was laundering drug money through legitimate ranches, and now his former associates want to tie up loose ends?" Sarah shook her head. "They own people, Jake. Police, judges, politicians. The only reason I've stayed alive this long is by staying invisible." "Then what do you suggest?" Sarah met his eyes, and Jake saw a steely determination that reminded him of the girl who'd once insisted on learning to rope calves, despite her father's objections. "We disappear," she said, "both of us, tonight." Jake stared at Sarah as if she'd just suggested they sprout wings and fly to Mars. "Disappear? This is my home, Sarah. My grandfather built this ranch with his bare hands. 3 generations of my family are buried in that cemetery down the road. And you'll join them if you stay here," Sarah said quietly. "These aren't small-time criminals, Jake. They have resources you can't imagine. Money, connections, people in every level of government. When they decide someone needs to die, that person dies." Dawn was breaking over the crazy mountains, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold that would have been beautiful under different circumstances. Jake walked to the kitchen window and surveyed his domain, 1,500 acres of prime Montana, rangeland that had been in his family for 70 years. Somewhere out there, his surviving cattle were scattered across the pastures, probably confused and traumatized by the night's events. They'd need to be rounded up, counted, cared for. "I can't just walk away from all this," he said, "even if I wanted to, which I don't. The ranch employs 4 people. Tommy's got a wife and 2 kids. Carlos and Miguel send money back to their families in Texas. What happens to them if I disappear? What happens to them if you're dead?" Sarah stood up, letting the blanket fall. Away. In the morning light, Jake could see the full extent of her injuries from the previous night. Burns on her hands and arms, cuts from flying debris, and a bruise on her left temple that was turning an ugly shade of purple. These people don't leave witnesses, Jake. Anyone who might have seen something, anyone who might know something. They eliminate them all. Jake turned away from the window, his mind racing through possibilities. How long do we have? I don't know. Maybe hours, maybe days. Depends on how carefully they're being. If they're smart, they'll wait a few days before making any moves. Let people assume the barn fire was just bad luck, but if they're in a hurry... She shrugged, and Jake caught a glimpse of the fatalism that had kept her alive for 10 years. There has to be another way. What about the FBI? You said you were going to them before. That was 10 years ago when I had evidence. When I had access to my father's records and could prove what was happening. Now, I'm just a dead woman with a story nobody will believe. Sarah moved to stand beside him at the window. Besides, how many federal agents do you think they'd have? To kill, to keep this quiet? These people have been operating for decades. They've survived FBI investigations before. Jake felt the walls of his world closing in around him. Everything he'd built, everything he'd worked for, suddenly felt as fragile as tissue paper in a hurricane. The Double M Ranch, his sanctuary and his purpose, had become a trap. "My truck," he said suddenly. "It's parked behind the equipment shed. If they're watching the house, they might not have seen it yet." Sarah nodded. "We'll need supplies, food, water, cash. Anything you can't live without." "I need to warn Tommy and the others." "Absolutely not." Sarah's voice was sharp. "The moment you contact them, you put them in danger. The only way to protect them is to stay away from them." Jake wanted to argue, but he knew she was right. The less his employees knew about the situation, the safer they'd be. Still, the thought of abandoning them without explanation felt like betrayal. He moved quickly through the house, gathering essentials. Cash from the hidden safe in his bedroom, about $3,000 he kept for emergencies, extra clothes, his grandfather's service revolver and a box of ammunition, basic medical supplies. Sarah helped, moving with the efficiency of someone who'd done this before. "Where will we go?" Jake asked as he stuffed supplies into a duffel bag. "I have a place, a cabin in the Bridger Mountains that doesn't exist on any official records. It's primitive, but it's safe. We can figure out our next move from there." Jake paused in his packing. "How long have you been planning this?" "Since the day I realized they might come looking for me. I've had a backup plan for every year of the past decade, Jake. Different identities, different hideouts, different escape routes. It's the only way to stay alive when you're living on borrowed time." The transformation of the girl he'd known into this hardened survivor was perhaps the most heartbreaking aspect of the entire situation. The Sarah Mitchell he'd fallen in love with had been trusting, optimistic, eager to see the best in everyone. This woman checking her watch and calculating travel times was a stranger wearing a familiar face. "We need to go," Sarah said, glancing out the window. "Full daylight means more risk." Jake took a last look around the kitchen where he'd eaten breakfast every morning for 10 years. The coffee pot was still plugged in, the dishes from the previous day still in the sink. Everything looked normal, peaceful, completely at odds with the chaos his life had become. They slipped out the back door, staying low and moving quickly toward the equipment shed. Jake's Ford pickup sat where he'd left it, covered by a tarp and hidden from casual observation. He'd bought the truck used 5 years ago as a backup vehicle, and it had the virtue of being unremarkable, just another dusty ranch truck that wouldn't attract attention on Montana's back roads. Sarah climbed into the passenger seat while Jake loaded their supplies. Rex appeared from somewhere, tail wagging, expecting to join whatever adventure was beginning. "The dog can't come," Sarah said. Jake looked at the border collie, remembering how Blue had lived to be 14 before arthritis and old age finally claimed him. Rex was young, eager, full of potential. The thought of abandoning him felt like another small death. "He'll starve. Tommy will take care of him. Ranch dogs know how to survive, and your hired hands will be back to work as soon as the storm damage is cleared." Jake knew she was right, but it didn't make the decision any easier. He knelt down and scratched Rex behind the ears, looking into trusting brown eyes that had no understanding of betrayal or abandonment. "Stay, boy. Stay here and wait for Tommy." The truck started on the second try, and Jake backed it carefully out of the shed. The dirt road that led to the county highway was muddy from the storm, but passable. As they drove away from the double-M ranch, Jake caught a glimpse of the barn ruins in his side mirror, a black scar on the landscape that had been his life. Sarah directed him onto increasingly remote roads, following routes that barely qualified as tracks through the Montana wilderness. They were heading northeast, toward the Bridger Range, but taking a circuitous path that avoided main highways and populated areas. The truck bounced and lurched over rocks and ruts, and Jake was grateful for its high clearance and four-wheel drive. "Tell me about this cabin," he said, needing conversation to distract from the magnitude of what they were doing. "I bought it 3 years ago through a shell corporation. Paid cash, no financing, no official records that could be traced back to me. It's about 40 miles from the nearest neighbor, completely off-grid. Solar panels for electricity, a well for water, propane for heat, everything we need to disappear for as long as necessary. You've thought this through." "I've had to." Sarah was scanning the landscape constantly, watching for any sign of pursuit. When you're living under an assumed identity, you learn to plan for every contingency. The cabin was my nuclear option, the place I'd go if everything else fell. Apart, they drove in silence for a while, climbing into the foothills of the Bridger Range. The aspens were spectacular this time of year, their golden leaves shimmering in the morning sun like scattered coins. Under different circumstances, it would have been a beautiful drive through some of Montana's most pristine wilderness. "Jake," Sarah said suddenly, "there's something else I need to tell you." The tone of her voice made his stomach clench. "What? Now?" "The barn wasn't the only target last night. They also hit your house. Jake nearly drove off the narrow track." "What do you mean?" "While you were fighting the fire, they were inside searching for evidence, looking for anything that might connect you to me or suggest that you knew more than you should about my father's business." Sarah's voice was matter-of-fact, but Jake could hear the guilt underneath. "They probably planted listening devices too, maybe cameras. From now on, everything you do at the ranch will be monitored." "How do you know this?" "Because it's what I would do. Standard procedure when you're trying to determine how much a potential target knows." Sarah turned in her seat to face him. "They'll watch for a few days, gather intelligence, then make their decision about what to do with you." Jake thought about his employees returning to work, walking into a ranch that was now under surveillance. The idea of Tommy or Carlos or Miguel being hurt because of something they might accidentally see or hear made him sick. "We have to warn them." "We can't. Any contact puts them at greater risk. The best thing we can do for your people is stay as far away from them as possible." The track they were following became increasingly rough, eventually dwindling to little more than a game trail through dense forest. Jake had to engage the truck's low-range gearing and creep forward at walking speed. Tree branches scraped against the windows, and more than once he was sure they were completely lost. "How do you even know about this place?" he asked. I've been exploring these mountains for 3 years, looking for the perfect hideout. This cabin belonged to an old prospector who died without any heirs. The property reverted to the state, but it was so remote that nobody bothered to do anything with it. I filed the right paperwork, paid the back taxes, and made it legally mine. Under what name? Patricia Williams. Complete identity, including social security number, driver's license, employment history. It cost me $15,000 and it took 6 months to put together, but it's bulletproof. Jake marveled at the complexity of her hidden life. While he'd been struggling to manage a ranch and deal with his grief, Sarah had been building an elaborate network of false identities and escape routes. The contrast between their two paths since the wedding that never was couldn't have been starker. The cabin appeared suddenly through the trees, a small log structure that looked like it had grown from the forest floor. Solar panels glinted on the metal roof, and Jake could see a satellite dish mounted on a tall pole. Smoke rose from the chimney, suggesting someone was home. "Expecting company?" Jake asked. Sarah smiled for the first time since he'd found her in the burning barn. "I've had a caretaker living here for the past 6 months, someone I trust completely." As if summoned by her words, the cabin door opened and a figure stepped onto the small porch. Jake's breath caught in his throat as he recognized the man, older, grayer, but unmistakably the same person who terrified him as a child. "Martinez," Sarah said simply. "He didn't really die of a heart attack." Eduardo Martinez looked exactly like what he was, a career criminal who'd spent decades doing terrible things for terrible people. He was in his 60s now, his black hair shot through with silver, but he still moved with the fluid grace of a predator. Tattoos covered his arms, and a scar ran from his left ear to the corner of his mouth. But when he saw Sarah climbing out of the truck, his weathered face broke into a genuine smile. "Mija," he said, embracing her like a father. "I was worried when you didn't check in yesterday." "We had complications." Sarah gestured toward Jake. "Eduardo, this is Jake Morrison, the rancher I told you about." Martinez studied Jake with eyes that had seen too much violence. "The one you were supposed to marry." "That's right." Martinez nodded slowly, then extended his hand. "Welcome to our little sanctuary, Mr. Morrison. I'm sorry it had to be under these circumstances." Jake shook the offered hand, noting the calluses and scars that spoke of a life lived on the edge of violence. This was the man who'd saved Sarah's life 10 years ago, who'd helped her disappear and stay hidden. Whatever his past crimes, Jake owed him a debt that could never be repaid. "How bad is it?" Martinez asked Sarah. "Bad. They found me in Denver, torched Jake's barn, probably searched his house. We're completely exposed." Martinez nodded grimly. "I figured as much when I saw the smoke last night. Your father's old partners are getting nervous about loose ends. Word is, they're planning something big, and they want to clean the house first." "What kind of something big?" "Expansion. They're looking to move into Wyoming, maybe Colorado. But first, they need to eliminate anyone who might know too much about their Montana operations." Martinez looked at Jake. "Unfortunately, Mr. Morrison, that now includes you." Jake felt the weight of his new reality settling over him like a blanket. His old life was over, as surely as if he'd died in the barn fire. The Double M Ranch, his employees, his community, all of it was now part of a past he could never reclaim. "So what do we do?" he asked. Martinez smiled, and Jake caught a glimpse of the dangerous man he'd once been. "We do what I've been training for my whole life, Mr. Morrison. We disappear so completely that they'll think we never existed. And then, when they least expect it, we strike back." The cabin's interior was spartanly furnished, but surprisingly comfortable. Martinez had clearly been living here for months, adding touches that made the space livable. a well-stocked kitchen, comfortable furniture, and walls lined with maps of Montana, Wyoming, and Colorado. What caught Jake's attention immediately were the surveillance monitors stacked on a desk in the corner, showing feeds from cameras positioned around the property. "You've been busy," Sarah said, examining the setup. "Old habits," Martinez replied, pouring coffee from a pot that smelled like it had been brewing since dawn. "When you've spent 30 years watching your back, you don't stop just because you're retired." Jake accepted a mug and settled into a chair near the fireplace. The warmth felt good after the stress of their escape, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he was living in someone else's nightmare. 24 hours ago, his biggest worry had been storm damage to his fencing. Now he was a fugitive, hiding in the mountains with a dead woman and a reformed cartel enforcer. "You said something about striking back," Jake said to Martinez. "What did you mean?" The older man exchanged a glance with Sarah before answering. "Your father-in-law's old associates have been operating with impunity for too long. They think they're untouchable because they've bought protection from local law enforcement. But they've also made enemies, other criminal organizations, federal agents who can't be bought, victims' families who want justice." Sarah pulled out a laptop from her bag and powered it up. "Eduardo has been collecting information for years. Names, dates, locations, financial records. Everything we'd need to bring down the entire operation." "You're talking about going to war with a drug cartel," Jake said incredulously. "2 people and whatever evidence you've managed to gather." "3 people, Martinez corrected. "And we wouldn't be alone. I still have contacts in Mexico, people who would be very interested in eliminating competition north of the border. Plus there are federal agents who've been trying to build a case against these people for years. They just need someone willing to testify." Jake stood up and walked to one of the windows. Through the trees, he could see the rugged peaks of the Bridger Range stretching toward the horizon. It was a beautiful country, the kind of wilderness that had attracted his grandfather after the war. Magnus Morrison had come to Montana looking for peace, for a place where he could build something lasting and good. The idea of turning that legacy into a battlefield felt like sacrilege. "What about my ranch?" Jake asked. "My employees? The community? What about them?" Sarah's voice was gentle but firm. "If we do nothing, these people will continue to use Willow Creek as a front for their operations. More ranches will be compromised. More young people will be recruited as mules or enforcers. Eventually, the whole county will be corrupted." Martinez opened a filing cabinet and pulled out a thick folder. "Take a look at this," he said, spreading photographs across the table. "These are surveillance photos I took over the past 6 months. Recognize anyone?" Jake studied the images, and his blood ran cold. There was Mayor Patricia Dalton accepting an envelope from a man he didn't recognize. Sheriff Bob Hensley shaking hands with another stranger outside the county courthouse. Even Father McKenna from St. Mary's Catholic Church was captured meeting with suspicious individuals in what looked like the church parking lot. "They've been building a network," Martinez explained, "bribing officials, compromising community leaders, establishing a support system that allows them to operate openly. Your father-in-law was just the beginning." Sarah pulled up files on her laptop, showing financial records that painted a picture of systematic corruption. Bank transfers, property purchases, campaign contributions, all of it traced back to shell companies that funneled drug money into legitimate businesses and political campaigns. "The Mitchell Ranch was their proof of concept," Sarah said. "They've been using the same model to compromise ranchers across 3 states. Find someone with financial problems, offer them easy money, then gradually take control of their operations." Jake recognized several names on the list, ranchers he'd known for years, men he'd considered friends and neighbors. The Hendersons had been struggling with drought for 3 seasons. The Lawsons had lost half their herd to disease 2 years ago. The Yamaguchis had been fighting for closure since old Henry broke his back in a riding accident. All of them? Jake asked. Not willingly at first, but debt makes people desperate, and desperate people make compromises they never thought they would. Martinez's voice carried the weight of experience. I've seen it happen across Mexico, Guatemala, Colombia. The pattern is always the same. Sarah showed him more files, shipping records that revealed cattle trucks making unusual stops, veterinary records that didn't match actual herd sizes, and financial statements that suggested ranches were selling far more beef than they could possibly produce. They're moving product through the existing agricultural infrastructure, she explained. Drugs hidden in cattle trucks, money laundered through livestock sales, distribution networks disguised as ranch supply companies. It's brilliant, really. Who's going to search a truck full of cattle heading to market? Jake felt sick as the scope of the operation became clear. His entire community, the way of life he'd cherished and protected, had been systematically infiltrated and corrupted. The men and women he'd trusted, the institutions he'd respected, all of it was built on a foundation of lies and criminal money. Why haven't the feds shut this down? He asked. Because they need witnesses, Martinez said. Someone on the inside who can testify about how the system works, who can identify the key players and explain the financial structure. Most of the people involved are too scared to talk, and the few who might have tried. He gestured at Sarah. Well, you've seen what happens to them. Sarah pulled up another file, this one containing birth certificates, school records, and employment histories. I'm not the only one who was supposed to disappear. Over the past 10 years, at least a dozen people who knew too much about the operation have died in suspicious circumstances. Car accidents, hunting mishaps, heart attacks in people too young to have heart problems. Jake studied the faces in the photographs, some familiar, some strangers. All of them had died because they'd learned something they shouldn't have, or seen something that made them dangerous to people who killed as casually as other men swatted flies. So what's the plan? Jake asked finally. Martinez smiled grimly. We gather everything we need to make an airtight case: financial records, shipping documents, surveillance footage, recorded conversations. Then we contact someone in the Justice Department who can't be bought, and there are a few of them left, and we offer them the biggest RICO case in Montana history. And if they refuse to act, then we take matters into our own hands, Sarah said quietly. Eduardo knows people who specialize in permanent solutions to cartel problems. Jake looked at the woman he'd once planned to marry, seeing clearly how the past 10 years had changed her. The girl who'd cried watching Old Yeller was now calmly discussing assassination with a former cartel enforcer. The transformation was both heartbreaking and terrifying. There's a third option, Jake said slowly. We could just disappear, take new identities, move somewhere far away, start over completely. And let them continue to destroy communities like Willow Creek? Sarah
shook her head.
I've been running for 10 years, Jake. I'm tired of being afraid, tired of looking over my shoulder, tired of pretending to be someone I'm not. These people stole my life and I want it back. Martinez stood up and walked to the window, studying. The security monitors. Besides, running isn't really an option anymore. They know you're alive. They know you were at the ranch. They'll keep looking until they find you, no matter how far you go or how deep you hide. So we fight. We fight, Sarah confirmed. But we do it smart. We gather our evidence, we build our case, and we make sure that when we move, we take down the entire organization at once. Jake considered the alternatives, trying to find some other path that didn't lead to violence or a lifetime of hiding. But every option seemed to end in death, either his own or that of innocent people who'd been caught up in something beyond their understanding. What do you need from me? He asked. Martinez turned from the window, and Jake saw approval in the Older man's eyes. Access. You know these people, you understand how their businesses operate. More importantly, they trust you, or they did before last night. We need someone who can get close enough to gather the evidence we need. They're watching my ranch, probably listening to my phone calls. Which is why we're going to give them exactly what they expect to see, Sarah said. A grieving rancher trying to rebuild after a tragic fire. Someone who's too focused on his own problems to cause trouble for anyone else. She pulled up another file, this one containing architectural drawings and property surveys. The Mitchell Ranch is still the center of their Montana operations. They've been using it as a staging area, a place where shipments can be repackaged and rerouted. If we can get inside and document what's happening there, we'll have everything we need. Jake studied the familiar layouts, recognizing buildings. He'd visited countless times over the years. The barn where he'd helped Bill Mitchell with difficult carvings, the equipment shed where they'd shared beers and talked about weather and cattle prices, the house where Sarah had grown up. All of it now serving as infrastructure for a criminal enterprise. Getting inside won't be easy, Martinez warned. They've upgraded security significantly since your father-in-law's death. Motion sensors, cameras, armed guards. It's not the friendly ranch operation you remember. But it's not impregnable either, Sarah added. I know every inch of that property, every hiding place and secret passage. And more importantly, I know where my father kept his records. Jake felt a chill as he realized what she was suggesting. You want to go back there? I have to. Everything we need to destroy this organization is hidden in my father's study. Financial. Records, contact lists, shipping schedules. He kept meticulous records of every transaction. If we can get to those files... It's suicide, Jake said flatly. They'll be expecting you to show up there eventually, which is why I won't be going alone. Sarah looked at him meaningfully. I need someone who can provide a distraction, someone they won't see as an immediate threat. Me. You. Jake Morrison, grief-stricken rancher, coming to pay his respects to his lost love's childhood home, maybe asking the new owners if they'd be interested in buying some of his remaining cattle since he's having trouble rebuilding after the fire. Martinez nodded approvingly. It's good. Gives you a legitimate reason to be there, and it positions you as someone looking to do business rather than cause trouble. Jake imagined walking up to the front door of the Mitchell Ranch, shaking hands with the men who'd tried to kill Sarah, pretending to negotiate cattle sales while she searched for evidence that could destroy them all. The audacity of it was breathtaking. When? He asked. Soon, Sarah said, before they have time to move the records or upgrade their security further. But first, we need to prepare. Eduardo will teach you some basic surveillance techniques, how to plant recording devices, how to spot an ambush. I'll brief you on the layout of the house and where to find the information we need. Martinez pulled out a canvas bag filled with electronic equipment. Technology has improved significantly since my active days. Cameras the size of shirt buttons, microphones that can pick up conversations through walls, GPS trackers smaller than coins. Will wire you up like a Christmas tree before you go in there. Jake picked up one of the devices, marveling at its tiny size. What if they search me? They won't. Not if you play your part correctly. Desperate ranchers don't typically carry spy equipment. Sarah closed her laptop and stood up. But if something goes wrong, if they realize what you're really doing there, then... I'm dead, Jake finished. Then we're all dead, Martinez corrected, because they won't stop with you. They'll tear apart these mountains until they find this cabin, and they'll kill everyone associated with this operation. The weight of responsibility settled on Jake's shoulders like a physical burden. Not just his own life, but the lives of the only two people who could bring justice to Willow Creek, hung in the balance of his ability to convince hardened criminals that he was just another broken-down rancher looking for a way to survive. No pressure, he said dryly. Sarah smiled, the first genuine smile he'd seen from her since their reunion. For just a moment, she looked like the girl he'd fallen in love with all those years ago. "Welcome to my world, Jake Morrison," she said. "Population, 3 people crazy enough to take on a drug cartel with nothing but determination and a really good plan." Outside, the October sun was climbing toward its zenith, warming the mountain air and painting the aspen leaves in shades of gold and amber. It was a beautiful country, the kind of place where a man could live peacefully for decades, without ever encountering true evil. But Jake now understood that peace was an illusion, and evil could hide behind the most innocent facades. If he wanted to reclaim his life and protect his community, he'd have to venture into darkness deeper than anything he'd ever imagined. The question was whether he'd emerge from that darkness still recognizable as the man he'd once been. The next 3 days passed in a blur of intensive preparation. Martinez proved to be a demanding teacher, drilling Jake on surveillance techniques, escape routes, and the subtle art of appearing harmless while gathering intelligence. The former cartel enforcer had transformed the cabin's basement into a makeshift training facility, complete with mock-ups of the Mitchell Ranch's interior layout. "Confidence is everything," Martinez explained as he adjusted the micro-camera hidden in Jake's shirt collar. "These men are predators. They can smell fear from across a room. The moment you show uncertainty or nervousness, they'll know something is wrong." Jake practiced his cover story until it became second nature. He was a struggling rancher, desperate to sell his remaining cattle after the barn fire had devastated his operation. The insurance payout wouldn't be enough to rebuild, and winter was coming fast. He'd heard through mutual acquaintances that the new owners of the Mitchell Ranch might be interested in expanding their herd. "Remember," Sarah said, reviewing the house plans for the 100th time, "my father's study is on the 2nd floor, 3rd door on the right. The safe is behind the painting of the Yellowstone River. The combination is my mother's birthday, 0847. Everything we need should be in there." What if they've moved the files? They haven't. I checked the property records. They bought the ranch as a going concern, including all furnishings and contents. They wouldn't risk destroying evidence until they're certain there are no other copies. Martinez handed Jake a leather portfolio containing fake cattle records and a business proposal. "This gives you a reason to be there for at least an hour. Ask to see the facilities. Express interest in their operation. The longer you can keep them talking, the more time Sarah has to work." The plan was elegantly simple in its audacity. While Jake distracted the ranch's new owners with legitimate business discussions, Sarah would slip into the house through a basement entrance she'd used as a teenager to sneak out after curfew. She'd photograph her father's records, download computer files, and gather physical evidence of the money laundering operation. "The basement door locks from the inside," Sarah explained. "I'll need exactly 45 minutes to get in, access the safe, and get back out. Any longer, and someone might notice the door's been tampered with." Jake studied the tiny communication device Martinez had given him, a nearly invisible earpiece that would keep him in contact with Sarah throughout the operation. "What if something goes wrong?" "Then you abort immediately," Martinez said firmly. "Don't try to be a hero. These people have killed for much less than what you're attempting." The night before the mission, Jake found himself unable to sleep. He sat by the cabin's fireplace, staring into the flames and thinking about the path that had brought him to this moment. A week ago, he'd been a simple rancher whose biggest worry was storm damage. Now he was preparing to infiltrate a criminal organization that had murdered dozens of people. Sarah emerged from the back bedroom, where she'd been resting, moving silently across the cabin floor. She'd changed clothes, trading her borrowed ranchwear for dark jeans and a black sweater that would help her blend into shadows. "Having second thoughts?" she asked, settling into the chair beside him. "Third and fourth thoughts," Jake admitted. "This is insane, Sarah. We're walking into a trap." "Maybe, but it's better than spending the rest of our lives running." She reached over and took his hand, her fingers warm despite the cool mountain air. "I know what I'm asking of you, Jake. I know what I put you through 10 years ago. If you want to walk away from this, I'll understand." Jake looked at their joined hands, remembering all the times they'd sat together like this during their courtship, planning their future, dreaming about the life they'd build together on the Double M Ranch. Those dreams felt like they belonged to different people now. "If we pull this off," he said slowly, "if we actually manage to destroy this organization, what? Then do we try to pick up where we left off 10 years ago?" Sarah was quiet for a long moment. "I don't know if that's possible," she said finally. "We're different people now. You've built a life without me, and I've learned to survive in a world you can't imagine. The girl you fell in love with died in that car accident, Jake. I'm what crawled out of the wreckage. And the man I was died when I thought you were gone," Jake replied. "So maybe we're both starting fresh." "Maybe we are." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the fire burn down to glowing embers. Outside, the wind sighed through the pine trees, carrying the scent of snow that would arrive within weeks. Winter in the mountains was harsh but clean, washing away the debris of autumn and leaving everything pristine for spring's renewal. "Promise me something," Sarah said as the clock approached midnight. "If this goes wrong tomorrow, if they catch me, don't try to rescue me. Take the evidence we've already gathered and get it to the FBI. Make sure this operation gets shut down, even if I don't survive to see it." Jake squeezed her hand. "Promise me the same thing. If they figure out what I'm doing, you run, don't look back. Deal." Morning came too quickly, grey and overcast with the promise of rain. Martinez checked their equipment one final time, ensuring that every camera and microphone was functioning properly. The surveillance gear was nearly invisible, built into Jake's clothing and personal items with such skill that even careful inspection wouldn't reveal their presence. "Remember the protocols," Martinez said as they loaded Jake's truck. "If either of you doesn't check in at the designated times, I'm calling in the cavalry." "What cavalry?" Jake asked. "You'd be surprised how many federal agents owe me favors," Martinez replied with a grim smile. "They might not be able to prevent a war, but they can certainly end one." The drive to the Mitchell Ranch took 40 minutes on winding back roads that Jake had traveled countless times over the years. Every landmark brought back memories: the creek where he and Sarah had gone fishing, the hill where they'd watched fireworks on the 4th of July, the old oak tree where he'd first kissed her under a Montana sunset. As they approached the ranch's main gate, Jake was struck by how much had changed. New fencing, security cameras, and warning signs that hadn't been there during Bill Mitchell's lifetime. The friendly, open atmosphere that had characterized the place for decades had been replaced by something that felt more like a fortress. "This is it," Sarah said quietly from her position, crouched in the truck bed, hidden under a tarp with their equipment. "Last chance to change your mind." "Too late for that," Jake replied, pulling up to the gate's intercom system. A voice crackled through. The speaker, male, young, with a slight accent that Jake couldn't place. "State your business." "Jake Morrison from the Double M Ranch. I have an appointment with Mr. Castellanos about purchasing cattle." The gate swung open after a brief delay, and Jake drove through onto property he'd visited dozens of times but which now felt completely foreign. The changes were subtle but pervasive. Too many vehicles for a normal ranching operation, buildings that served no obvious agricultural purpose, and men who carried themselves like soldiers rather than cowboys. Jake parked near the main house and climbed out of the truck, forcing his hands to remain steady as he retrieved his portfolio. Every instinct screamed at him to get back in the vehicle and drive away as fast as possible. but he thought about his burned barn, his scattered cattle, and the community that had been corrupted by the people he was about to face. The front door opened before he could knock, revealing a man in his 50s with silver hair and expensive clothes that had never seen honest ranch work. This would be Castellanos, the new owner who'd bought the Mitchell Ranch within weeks of Bill's death. "Mr. Morrison," the man said with a practiced smile, "thank you for coming. I'm Roberto Castellanos. Please, come in." Jake stepped across the threshold into a house he'd visited regularly for 20 years, but which had been transformed beyond recognition. Gone were the family photos, the rustic furniture, and the comfortable clutter that had made the place feel like a home. In their place was sleek, modern decor that belonged in a city penthouse rather than a Montana ranch house. "I'm sorry for your loss," Castellanos continued, leading Jake toward what had once been Bill Mitchell's sitting room. "The barn fire was a terrible tragedy. I hope your insurance will cover the replacement costs." "Partially," Jake replied, settling into a leather chair that probably cost more than most people made in a month. "That's actually why I'm here. I need to liquidate some assets quickly to finance the rebuilding." "Of course. I understand you have some excellent breeding stock." Jake launched into his prepared presentation, describing his cattle in detail while his eyes memorized the layout of the room. Security cameras in 3 corners, motion sensors near the windows, and at least 2 men positioned where they could monitor the conversation without appearing to do so. Through his earpiece, he heard Sarah's whispered voice. "I'm in position. Beginning entry now." Jake forced himself to focus on the conversation, knowing that any distraction could prove fatal. Castellanos seemed genuinely interested in the cattle, asking detailed questions about bloodlines and breeding history that suggested he wasn't entirely ignorant about ranching operations. "I'd like to see the animals before making an offer," Castellanos said. "Perhaps we could drive out to your ranch this afternoon." "Actually, I was hoping to see your operation first," Jake replied smoothly. "I'm always interested in learning from successful ranchers, and I hear you've made some impressive improvements to the property." Castellanos' smile didn't waver, but Jake caught a flicker of something in his eyes. Calculation, perhaps even suspicion. "I'd be happy to show you around, though I should mention that some areas are off-limits due to ongoing construction projects." "In position," Sarah's voice whispered in his ear. "Accessing the study now." Jake nodded enthusiastically. "I completely understand. Safety first." They left the house and began a tour of the facilities that had once been as familiar to Jake as his own property, but every building had been modified in some way. Additional security, reinforced doors, windows that had been bricked over or fitted with bars. What had once been an open, welcoming ranch had become something that resembled a military compound. "Impressive security system," Jake commented as they passed another cluster of cameras. "Necessary, unfortunately," Castellanos replied. "We've had problems with rustlers in the area. Can't be too careful these days." "I'm in the safe," Sarah reported. "Files are here, but there are a lot of them. This might take longer than expected." Jake's pulse quickened, but he kept his expression neutral. "I know what you mean about rustlers. Lost some cattle myself last year to thieves." They continued the tour, with Castellanos pointing out improvements and modifications that supposedly enhanced the ranch's efficiency. But Jake could see the real purpose behind many of the changes: loading docks designed for trucks rather than cattle trailers, storage buildings with reinforced floors that could support unusual weight, and communication equipment that went far beyond what any legitimate ranching operation would require. 20 minutes remaining. Sarah's voice was tense but controlled. "Found the shipping records. This is bigger than we thought, Jake. They're moving product through half the state." Jake nodded appropriately at something Castellanos was saying about grain storage. while his mind raced through the implications of Sarah's discovery. If the operation was as extensive as she suggested, bringing it down would require more than just local law enforcement. "I have a helicopter arriving shortly," Castellanos said suddenly, checking his expensive watch. "Business associates from Denver, would you mind if we wrapped up our tour? We can discuss the cattle purchase over lunch." 15 minutes, Sarah whispered urgently. "Almost finished, but I need more time." Jake's blood ran cold as he heard the distant sound of rotor blades. "Of course," he said to Castellanos, "I appreciate you taking the time to show me around." As they walked back toward the house, Jake caught sight of movement in the upstairs. Windows, a shadow that shouldn't have been there, a brief glimpse of dark clothing that made his heart stop. Someone had spotted Sarah. "Actually," Jake said quickly, "I'm feeling a bit lightheaded. The altitude, probably. Could I trouble you?" "For a glass of water?" Castellanos frowned slightly but nodded. "Of course. Carlos, get Mr. Morrison some water." One of the men who'd been shadowing them throughout the tour stepped forward, and Jake realized with growing horror that this wasn't going to end well. The man's hand was resting on what was obviously a concealed weapon, and his eyes held the flat, emotionless stare of a professional killer. "Sarah," Jake whispered as quietly as possible, "you need to get out now." But even as he spoke, he saw armed men moving toward the house from multiple directions. The helicopter was landing in the yard, disgorging passengers who moved with military precision. And through the front window, Jake caught a glimpse of someone being escorted down the stairs, someone with dark hair and a black sweater who'd run out of time and options. The game was up. And Jake realized with crystalline clarity that none of them were leaving the Mitchell Ranch alive. Jake's mind raced as armed men converged on the house from all directions. The helicopter had disgorged 4 passengers, all wearing dark suits that marked them as serious players in whatever criminal hierarchy controlled this operation. Through the window, he could see Sarah being marched down the main staircase by 2 guards, her hands zip-tied behind her back but her head held high in defiance. "Mr. Morrison," Castellanos said, his friendly facade evaporating like morning mist, "I'm afraid there's been a change of plans regarding our cattle discussion." Jake forced himself to remain calm, though every instinct screamed at him to fight or run. "I'm not sure what you mean. Please don't insult my intelligence. Did you really think we wouldn't notice a dead woman breaking into our secure facility?" Castellanos gestured toward the window where Sarah was visible. "Sarah Mitchell has been a ghost for 10 years, but ghosts have a way of coming back to haunt the living." The front door opened, and Sarah was escorted into the room by guards who handled her with the casual professionalism of men accustomed to dealing with prisoners. Her green eyes found Jake's immediately, and he saw something there that surprised him. Not fear, but determination mixed with what looked almost like relief. "Hello, Roberto," Sarah said calmly. "Still playing dress-up as a legitimate businessman, I see." Castellanos backhanded her across the face with casual violence that made Jake surge forward before the guard's weapons could stop him. "Careful. Mr. Morrison, your heroic impulses will only get you killed faster. Let her go," Jake said through gritted teeth. "This is between you and me. Actually, it's between us and approximately 15 terabytes of stolen data," said a new voice from the doorway. The speaker was a woman in her 40s, expensively dressed and carrying herself with the authority of someone accustomed to command. "Dr. Sarah Mitchell downloaded quite a bit of information from our servers before we interrupted her little espionage mission." Sarah smiled despite the blood trickling from her split lip. "Meet Amanda Vega, Jake. She's the brains behind this whole operation. Roberto here is just middle management." Vega studied Jake with cold calculation. "Jake Morrison, 32, owner of the Double M Ranch, grandson of Magnus Morrison, who served in Korea." No military background, no criminal record, no obvious connections to law enforcement or rival criminal organizations. She paused, which raises the interesting question of why a simple rancher would risk his life helping a dead woman steal classified information. "Maybe I just don't like seeing my community corrupted by drug dealers," Jake replied. "Your community was dying long before we arrived," Vega said dismissively. "Falling cattle prices, corporate agriculture squeezing out family farms, young people leaving for cities because there's no future in rural Montana. We breathe life back into this place by turning it into a distribution hub for poison, by providing economic opportunities that didn't exist otherwise. Do you think the Henderson family cares where their money comes from when it keeps their ranch out of foreclosure? Do you think Mayor Dalton worries about the source of the campaign contributions that got her re-elected?" Jake felt sick as he realized the scope of the corruption. These people hadn't just bribed a few officials, they'd systematically purchased an entire community, making everyone complicit in their own destruction. "What do you want?" Jake asked. "Information," Vega replied. "Specifically, we want to know who else is involved in this operation. Your little reconnaissance mission was too sophisticated for two amateurs working alone," Sarah laughed bitterly. "You think we're part of some larger conspiracy. We're just two people who got tired of running." "Perhaps, but the surveillance equipment you're carrying suggests otherwise. Military-grade communications gear, cameras that cost more than most people make in a year, GPS trackers that broadcast on encrypted frequencies." Vega nodded to one of her men, who began searching Jake thoroughly. "This is professional-level espionage equipment." Jake's heart sank as the guard efficiently located and removed every piece of surveillance gear Martinez had given him. The tiny cameras, the communication devices, the recording equipment, all of it was laid out on a nearby table like evidence in a courtroom. "Now," Vega continued, "you're going to tell me where you acquired this equipment and who's been helping you. You're going to provide names, locations, and operational details, and you're going to do it quickly before I lose patience and start removing pieces of your anatomy." "Go to hell," Sarah said flatly. Vega sighed as if dealing with unruly children. "I was hoping we could handle this civilly, but I see that's not possible." She nodded to Castellanos, who pulled out a smartphone and began scrolling through contacts. "What are you doing?" Jake demanded. "Calling in a specialist," Vega replied. "Someone who's very good at extracting information from reluctant subjects. He should be here within the hour." Jake's blood ran cold as he realized they had perhaps 60 minutes before torture began. Through the window he could see more vehicles, arriving, black SUVs that looked like they belonged to a federal agency, but probably contained more of Vega's security team. "In the meantime," Vega continued, "you'll be our guests. Carlos, take them to the basement. Make sure they're comfortable, but secure." The basement of the Mitchell Ranch had been transformed, just like everything else on the property. What had once been a storage area for canning supplies and holiday decorations was now a sterile holding facility, with reinforced walls and electronic locks. Jake and Sarah were separated into adjacent cells that looked like they'd been designed for exactly this purpose. "Quite an operation they've built here," Sarah called through the thin wall separating their cells. "How long do you think we have?" Jake asked. "Not long, but maybe long enough." "For what?" "Eduardo knows our timeline. When we don't check in, he'll know something went wrong." Jake slumped against the concrete wall, exhaustion finally catching up with him. One man against a small army, those aren't good odds. You'd be surprised what Eduardo can accomplish when he's motivated. And he's very motivated to keep me alive. Why? What aren't you telling me about your relationship with him?" Sarah was quiet for a long moment. "He's my father, Jake. My real father." The revelation hit Jake like a physical blow. What? Bill Mitchell wasn't my biological father. My mother had an affair 25 years ago with a man she met in Denver, a man who was working for a cartel but trying to get out. When she discovered she was pregnant, she convinced Bill that the baby was his. Jake's mind reeled as pieces of a puzzle he hadn't known existed suddenly clicked into place. Martinez is your father, Eduardo Martinez, former cartel enforcer turned government informant. He'd been working with the DEA for 3 years when the cartel discovered his betrayal. They put a price on his head, and he had to disappear completely. My mother never told him about me, but he found out. He's been watching me my whole life, Jake, from a distance, making sure I was safe, never interfering but always present. When the cartel ordered my death 10 years ago, he couldn't stand by and watch his daughter die for crimes he'd committed. The complexity of Sarah's hidden family history was staggering. Jake thought about Martinez's behavior at the cabin, the protective way he treated Sarah, the genuine emotion in his voice when he spoke about keeping her safe. So when you disappeared, he saved me, gave me a new identity, and spent the next 10 years teaching me how to survive in a world where people like these. Sarah gestured toward the ceiling. Consider murder a routine business expense. Footsteps echoed on the stairs above them, followed by the sound of multiple voices. Jake caught fragments of conversation in Spanish and English, and what he heard made his blood run cold. They were discussing operational security, debating whether to eliminate the prisoners immediately or wait for the specialist who could extract more detailed information. "Sarah," Jake whispered urgently, "is there anything about this basement you remember from when you were a kid? Any way out that they might not know about?" "Maybe. There's an old storm drain that connects to the main house's foundation. It was installed in the 1940s when the house was built, but I don't know if it's still accessible." Jake examined their cell more carefully, looking for any structural weakness or hidden access point. The walls appeared solid, but in one corner he noticed a section where the concrete looked newer than the rest. "There," Sarah said, following his gaze. "That's where the drain used to connect, but they've obviously sealed it. Maybe not permanently." Jake began working at the concrete with his belt buckle, scraping away mortar that was harder than it looked but not impossible to remove. The work was slow and produced telltale debris, but it was their only hope of escape before Vega's specialist arrived. Above them, the voices grew louder and more agitated. Jake caught enough Spanish to understand that someone was arguing about timeline and security protocols. Whatever was being debated, it didn't sound favorable for the prisoners. "Jake," Sarah said suddenly, "there's something else you need to know. The files I downloaded, they're not just about the Montana operation." "What do you mean?" "This organization is planning something massive. A coordinated expansion into 3 states involving dozens of legitimate businesses and hundreds of compromised officials. If they succeed, they'll control agricultural distribution throughout the entire Rocky Mountain region." Jake paused in his scraping. "How massive?" "Billions of dollars in drug revenue, laundered through ranches, farms, and agricultural cooperatives from Canada to Colorado. They're not just running a criminal enterprise, they're building a shadow economy that could dominate legitimate agriculture." The implications were staggering. What had started as a local corruption problem was actually part of a continental strategy to infiltrate and control food production infrastructure. If Vega and her associates succeeded, they'd have the power to manipulate food prices, control supply chains, and hold entire populations hostage. "The data I downloaded contains their complete operational plan," Sarah continued. "Financial projections, personnel assignments, political targets for bribery or elimination. Everything the feds would need to shut down the entire network." "Where is it now?" encrypted and uploaded to a secure server that Eduardo controls. But if we don't check in within 12 hours, he'll assume we're dead and destroy everything to prevent it from falling into the wrong hands. Jake resumed his work on the concrete with renewed urgency. Whatever happened to them personally, that information had to reach the authorities. The fate of countless communities across the region depended on exposing this conspiracy before it could fully metastasize. Chunk of concrete finally broke free, revealing a section of metal pipe that had been severed but not completely sealed. Jake could feel air moving through the gap, suggesting that the storm drain system was still at least partially intact. "Can you fit through there?" he asked Sarah. "Maybe. But what about you?" "I'll be right behind you. Go." Sarah squeezed through the narrow opening, her slender frame barely fitting through the gap Jake had created. He heard her moving through the pipe system, following passages that had been forgotten for decades. Jake was larger and had more difficulty navigating the tight space, but desperation gave him strength he didn't know he possessed. The storm drain was a maze of intersecting pipes and maintenance tunnels that eventually led to an exit point near the ranch's original well house. They emerged covered in dust and rust, but free. The well house provided temporary concealment while they assessed their situation. The ranch yard was crawling with armed men, and vehicles were positioned to block all obvious escape routes. "There," Sarah whispered, pointing toward a cluster of outbuildings near the ranch's eastern boundary. "The old grain silo. We can reach it without crossing open ground." They moved carefully from building to building, using shadows and abandoned equipment for cover. Jake's truck was no longer an option. It was surrounded by guards and probably disabled anyway. But Sarah led him to a maintenance shed where an old motorcycle was stored under a tarp. "Think it still runs?" Jake asked. "Only one way to find out." They leave. Bike started on the third kick, its engine loud enough to wake the dead. Shouts erupted from the direction of the main house as their escape was discovered, and Jake saw muzzle flashes as guards began shooting in their direction. Sarah climbed on behind him, and Jake gunned the engine toward the ranch's back gate. Bullets whined past them as they raced across the pasture, the motorcycle's small size and agility making them a difficult target in the gathering dusk. Behind them, vehicle engines roared to life as pursuit began. Jake could see headlights in his mirrors as SUVs and trucks tried to follow, but the motorcycle could go places wheeled vehicles couldn't, through fence gaps, across ditches, over terrain that would stop larger machines. "The main road," Sarah shouted over the engine noise. "If we can reach the highway, we might have a chance." Jake pushed the old motorcycle harder than it was designed to go, its engine screaming in protest as they climbed hills and jumped creek beds. The pursuing vehicles were falling behind, unable to match their cross-country speed, but Jake knew their fuel was limited and the ranch's security team would soon coordinate with other units to cut off escape routes. They reached the county highway just as darkness fell completely, the motorcycle's single headlight cutting through shadows that could hide pursuing vehicles. Jake turned north toward the Bridger Mountains, toward the cabin where Martinez was waiting for their return. But even as they raced through the Montana night, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that their real troubles were just beginning. Vega and her organization now knew they were alive, knew they had stolen critical information, and would stop at nothing to recover it. The quiet life Jake had built on the Double M Ranch was gone forever, replaced by a war he'd never wanted but couldn't. A void behind them, the lights of Willow Creek glowed in the distance, a community that didn't know it was about to become a battleground between criminal organizations and the few people brave enough to fight them. The motorcycle's engine began to sputter as they climbed into the mountains, fuel running dangerously low. Jake could only hope they'd reach safety before their luck ran out completely. The motorcycle's engine died completely 3 miles from the cabin, leaving Jake and Sarah stranded on a narrow mountain trail as darkness closed around them. Behind them, the distant glow of headlights suggested their pursuers hadn't given up the chase, though the rugged terrain was buying precious time. "We walk from here," Jake said, abandoning the bike beside the trail. The October night was turning cold, and their breath formed clouds in the thin mountain air. Sarah nodded, pulling her jacket tighter. "Eduardo will have heard the shots. He'll be watching for us." They moved carefully through the forest, using Jake's flashlight sparingly to avoid attracting attention. Every snapped twig or rustling branch made them freeze, listening for sounds of pursuit. The familiar woods that had seemed peaceful just days ago now felt like hostile territory where death could emerge from any shadow. After 20 minutes of careful navigation, they saw the warm glow of windows through the trees. The cabin appeared exactly as they'd left it, but something felt wrong. No smoke rose from the chimney, and the security monitors that should have been visible through the windows were dark. "Eduardo!" Sarah called softly as they approached the front porch. No answer. Jake drew his grandfather's revolver and motioned for Sarah to stay behind him as he tried the door. It opened easily, too easily for a man as security-conscious as Martinez. Inside, the cabin was a disaster zone. Furniture overturned, papers scattered, electronics destroyed. Signs of a violent struggle were everywhere, but no bodies. Jake checked each room methodically while Sarah examined the wreckage of their equipment. "They took him," Sarah said, her voice hollow. "But they left this." She held up a cell phone that had been deliberately placed on the kitchen table, positioned where they couldn't miss it. The device was already ringing as Sarah picked it up. "Answer it," Jake said grimly. Sarah pressed the speaker button. "Amanda." Vega's voice filled the cabin with cold authority. "I trust you made it back safely, despite our little misunderstanding at the ranch." "Where is he?" Sarah demanded. "Your associate is currently enjoying our hospitality at a secure location. His health and continued existence depend entirely on your cooperation." Jake leaned closer to the phone. "What do you want?" "I want the data Dr. Mitchell stole from our servers. All of it. You have 12 hours to deliver the complete files, unedited and uncopied, or we'll begin sending you pieces of your friend." "Even if we wanted to cooperate, we don't have access to those files," Sarah said. "They're on encrypted servers that require specific authorization codes. Then I suggest you find a way to obtain those codes. 12 hours, Dr. Mitchell. The exchange will take place at the old Copper Creek mine, 20 miles north of Billings. Come alone, bring the data, and your friend lives. Bring anyone else or try any heroics, and we'll mail his head to every law enforcement agency in Montana." The line went dead, leaving Jake and Sarah staring at each other in the ruins of their temporary sanctuary. The scope of their situation was becoming clear. Vega's organization was more extensive and better informed than they'd realized. "The files really are encrypted," Sarah said quietly. "Eduardo has the only access codes, and he'd die before giving them up." "Then we're back to square one." "Not exactly." Sarah moved to what remained of Martinez's desk, pulling out a hidden drawer that had somehow escaped the searcher's attention. Inside was a small notebook filled with handwritten codes and contact information. Eduardo always kept backups, old-school methods that can't be hacked or traced electronically. Jake examined the notebook, recognizing some of the entries as coordinates and others as communication frequencies. "Can you use this to access the files?" "Maybe. But I'll need computer equipment and an internet connection. Everything here has been destroyed. There's a library in Livingston with public computers. We could..." "No." Sarah shook her head firmly. "Too public, too many cameras. Vega's people might be monitoring public networks." She paused, thinking. "But there is another option." "My mother." Jake stared at her. "Your mother thinks you're dead." My mother has a satellite internet connection and a computer that she uses to manage her late husband's business investments. More importantly, she lives in the middle of nowhere and minds her own business. The plan that emerged was both simple and terrifying. They would drive to Ellen Mitchell's remote farmhouse in eastern Montana, where Sarah would reveal herself to the mother who'd buried her a decade ago. Using Ellen's computer and internet connection, Sarah would attempt to access the encrypted files that represented their only leverage against Vega's organization. "She might have a heart attack when she sees you," Jake warned, as they prepared to leave the destroyed cabin. "She's tougher than she looks. Besides, finding out her daughter is alive should be good news, even under these circumstances." They took Martinez's backup vehicle, a nondescript sedan that had been hidden in a camouflaged shed behind the cabin. The drive to Ellen Mitchell's farm would take 4 hours through back roads that avoided major highways and population centers. As they drove through the Montana night, Sarah explained more about the data she'd stolen and its potential impact. The files contained detailed financial records showing how drug money was laundered through agricultural businesses, personal information on dozens of compromised officials, and most importantly, operational plans for expanding the network into neighboring states. If the FBI gets this information, they can roll up the entire organization, Sarah said. But if Vega gets it back and eliminates the witnesses, she consolidates power and expands the operation nationwide, Jake finished. Exactly. This isn't just about saving Eduardo or even protecting ourselves anymore. If we fail, this model will be replicated across the country. Rural communities everywhere will be infiltrated and corrupted. The weight of responsibility felt crushing. Jake thought about Willow Creek, about his neighbors who'd been unknowingly drawn into a criminal conspiracy. The Hendersons, the Lawsons, the Yamaguchis, all of them trapped in a web they didn't understand. Ellen Mitchell's farmhouse sat alone on a section of prairie that stretched to the horizon in all directions. The nearest neighbor was 15 miles away, making it an ideal location for their purposes. Jake parked behind the house, where their vehicle wouldn't be visible from the road. "Let me talk to her first," Sarah said as they approached the back door. "This is going to be traumatic enough without adding a stranger to the mix." Jake waited by the car while Sarah knocked on the kitchen door. Through the windows, he could see warm light and the movement of someone preparing for bed. The door opened, revealing a woman in her 60s with grey hair and Sarah's green eyes. Ellen Mitchell's scream echoed across the prairie, followed by the sound of something heavy hitting the floor. Sarah disappeared into the house, and Jake heard voices, urgent explanations, sobbing, and gradually the kind of conversation that only a mother and daughter can have after a decade of separation. 20 minutes later, Sarah emerged and gestured for Jake to join them. Inside, Ellen Mitchell sat at her kitchen table, clutching a cup of coffee with shaking hands while tears streamed down her cheeks. "She told me everything," Ellen said when she saw Jake. "About Roberto, about the organization, about what really happened 10 years ago." Her voice was thick with emotion and anger. "I should have known. I should have seen the signs." "There was no way you could have known," Sarah said gently. "Dad was very careful to keep his legitimate business separate from the other activities. Your father, Bill, he wasn't a bad man," Ellen continued, "but he got in over his head, and by the time he realized what he'd gotten involved with, it was too late to get out." She looked at Jake. "He never meant for any of this to happen." Jake nodded, understanding now why Bill Mitchell had seemed increasingly troubled in the months before Sarah's disappearance. The man had been caught between criminal associates who wouldn't let him leave and a daughter who threatened to expose everything. "Mom, we need to use your computer," Sarah said. "It's the only way to save Eduardo and stop these people." Ellen led them to a small office where a modern computer setup looked incongruous among the farmhouse furniture. "Take whatever you need," Your father's password is Sarah's mom, all one word. Sarah began working immediately, her fingers flying over the keyboard as she accessed secure servers and navigated encrypted directories. Jake watched the clock, acutely aware that they had less than 8 hours before the deadline at Copper Creek Mine. "Got it," Sarah said finally. "The files are downloading now, but it's going to take at least an hour to get everything." "What? About backup plans?" Jake asked. "Even if we hand over the data, Vega has no reason to keep her word. That's where these come in handy." Sarah indicated a second set of files she was downloading. Eduardo's insurance policy, financial records, showing payments to specific federal agents, judges, and politicians. If anything happens to us, these files get automatically distributed to every major news organization and law enforcement agency in the country. Ellen had been listening quietly, but now she spoke up. "There's something else you should know. About the mine where they want to meet." Jake and Sarah turned to her expectantly. "Copper Creek Mine closed 20 years ago after a cave-in killed 6 workers. The whole area is unstable, tunnels that could collapse at any moment, open shafts that drop hundreds of feet, poisonous gases from the old mining operations." Ellen's expression was grim. "It's the perfect place for an ambush. No witnesses, no way to call for help, and plenty of ways to dispose of bodies permanently." Sarah paused her typing. "They're not planning to honor the exchange. They want the data, but they also want to eliminate everyone who knows about the operation. So we don't go to the mine," Jake said. "We have to. If we don't show up, they'll kill Eduardo and disappear completely." "But maybe—" Sarah's voice trailed off as she considered options. "Mom, do you still have Dad's old hunting rifles?" "In the gun safe." "Why?" "Because we're not going to the mine to surrender. We're going there to end this." Jake felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October night. "Sarah, we're talking about taking on a professional criminal organization with hunting rifles and determination. Those aren't good odds." "Better than letting them win," she replied firmly. "Eduardo didn't spend 10 years keeping me alive, so I could hand victory to the people who destroyed our family." Ellen stood up suddenly. "I'm coming with you." "Absolutely not," Sarah said immediately. "These people killed my husband. Maybe not directly, but the stress of dealing with them gave him the cancer that took his life. They stole 10 years with my daughter. They've corrupted my community and destroyed everything Bill worked to build." Ellen's voice grew stronger. "I know that mine better than anyone. My father worked there before it closed, and I played in those tunnels as a child. If you're going to Copper Creek, you need someone who knows the layout." Jake looked at the two women, mother and daughter reunited after a decade of grief and separation, both determined to fight an enemy that had already taken too much from them. The plan forming in his mind was desperate and dangerous, but it might be their only chance. "All right," he said finally, "but we do this smart. No heroics, no unnecessary risks. We get Eduardo out and gather enough evidence to destroy Vega's entire operation." Sarah's computer chimed as the file downloads completed. Terabytes of incriminating data that could topple a criminal empire, now stored on multiple devices and ready for distribution. Outside, dawn was beginning to break over the Montana prairie, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. In 6 hours, they would drive to Copper Creek Mine to face an enemy that had murdered dozens of people and corrupted an entire region. The odds were terrible, the risks enormous, and failure would mean death for all of them. But for the first time since Jake had pulled Sarah from his burning barn, he felt something that might have been hope. They had the evidence needed to destroy Vega's organization. They had allies who knew the terrain. And most importantly, they had something worth fighting for, not just their own lives, but the future of communities across the American West. The war for Willow Creek was about to begin. The Copper Creek Mine perched on a barren hillside like A wound in the earth, its rusted headframe and abandoned buildings testament to dreams that had died in darkness 20 years ago. Jake studied the terrain through binoculars from their concealed position half a mile away, noting vehicle positions and guard movements, while Ellen sketched the underground layout from memory. "Main entrance here," Ellen whispered, marking her. "Rough map. But there are 3 other ways in: the old ventilation shaft, the equipment tunnel, and the emergency exit that connects to the original claim office." She looked up at Jake and Sarah. "The question is where they're holding Eduardo." Sarah checked her watch. 2 hours until the scheduled exchange. Vega's people had been preparing the site since dawn. Black SUVs surrounded the mine's main buildings, and armed men patrolled the perimeter with military precision. "Most likely the processing building," Sarah said, studying the layout. "It's the most secure structure, easy to defend, and has multiple escape routes if something goes wrong." Jake counted at least 15 visible guards, plus however many were hidden inside the buildings. "They're not taking any chances. This whole thing is designed to eliminate witnesses." "Which is why we're not playing by their rules," Ellen said, firmly. She'd changed from her farmhouse clothes into dark jeans and a hunting jacket, and carried her late husband's .30-06 rifle with the confidence of someone who'd grown up shooting. "Eduardo's my daughter's. Eduardo matters to Sarah, which makes him family. Family doesn't abandon family." The plan they'd developed was based on Ellen's intimate knowledge of the mine's hidden passages and Jake's ranching experience with controlled explosions for clearing stumps and breaking ice. Using supplies from Ellen's farm and materials stolen from a construction site, they'd improvised enough explosive charges to collapse strategic tunnel sections and create chaos. "Remember," Sarah said as they prepared to move, "we only get one chance at this. Once we go active, they'll call in reinforcements and lock down the entire area." Jake shouldered his pack, heavy with explosive charges and detonators. "Ellen, you're sure about the tunnel stability? The main shaft is solid. It's why the mine operated for 60 years. But the newer tunnels they dug in the 1990s were poorly supported. A few well-placed charges will bring down enough rock to trap half their forces underground." They moved carefully down the hillside, using abandoned mining equipment and tailings piles for cover. Ellen led them to a concealed entrance she'd played in as a child, now hidden behind decades of vegetation growth. The metal door was rusted but functional, opening onto a maintenance tunnel that connected to the mine's main systems. Inside, the air was cold and heavy, with the scent of minerals and decay. Ellen's flashlight revealed tunnels that stretched into darkness, supported by rotting timbers and corroded metal. Water dripped constantly from the ceiling, and somewhere in the distance they could hear the echo of voices. "This way," Ellen whispered, leading them through passages that would have been impossible to navigate without her guidance. "The processing building is directly above us. If they're holding Eduardo there, we should be able to hear something." They climbed carefully through a vertical shaft that Ellen remembered from childhood explorations, emerging in a storage room beneath the main processing floor. Through the floorboards above, they could hear conversation in English and Spanish, including a voice Jake recognized as Amanda Vega's. "To confirm they have the data before we proceed with elimination protocols," Vega was saying. "No mistakes this time." "What about the old man?" asked a voice with a Mexican accent. "He's been asking for water. Give him whatever he wants. Dead." "Hostages have no negotiating value." Sarah's jaw tightened at the casual discussion of murder, but she remained focused on the mission. Jake placed explosive charges at structural points Ellen had identified, while Sarah hacked into the mine's old electrical system to prepare for a coordinated power failure. "Eduardo's definitely up there," Sarah whispered. "I can hear him coughing." Ellen checked her watch. 30 minutes until the exchange. We need to be in position. Jake activated the timer on his charges, set for 22 minutes, giving them time to reach their positions, but not enough for Vega's people to discover the explosives. They moved through the tunnel system to predetermined locations, with Ellen covering the main entrance, Jake positioning himself near the equipment tunnel, and Sarah approaching the processing building where Martinez was being held. At exactly noon, a convoy of 3 vehicles approached the mine entrance. Jake watched through his scope as the lead car stopped and a single figure emerged, a woman in business attire carrying a briefcase. She walked calmly toward the mine entrance, apparently unarmed and alone. "That's not Sarah," Jake muttered into his radio. "It's Rebecca Walsh," Ellen's voice crackled back. "FBI. I recognize her from the news." Jake's blood ran cold. Somehow, the authorities had learned about the exchange and sent an agent to negotiate. But Vega's people would never honor a deal with law enforcement, and Agent Walsh was walking into a death trap. "Sarah, abort your approach," Jake whispered urgently. "Federal agent on scene." "Negative. This is our only chance to save Eduardo." Through his scope, Jake watched Agent Walsh reach the mine entrance and call out to announce her presence. Armed men emerged from concealment, surrounding her with weapons drawn. She raised her hands but continued speaking, apparently trying to negotiate. "FBI!" Walsh's voice echoed across the hillside. "I'm here to discuss the safe return of Eduardo Martinez in exchange for immunity consideration for relevant parties." Vega appeared in the mine entrance, flanked by guards. Even at a distance, Jake could see her angry gestures as she realized the federal government had somehow learned about the operation. "This changes everything," Ellen said over the radio. "If they kill a federal agent, they're already committed." Sarah replied grimly. "There's no backing down now." Jake's timer showed 3 minutes until the explosions. Whether the FBI agent lived or died, the charges would detonate and hopefully create enough chaos for them to rescue Martinez. But the presence of law enforcement complicated everything. Agent Walsh continued her negotiation attempts, apparently unaware that she was surrounded by people who considered federal agents acceptable casualties. Jake could see Vega making hand signals to her men, positioning them for what looked like an execution. "I can't let them kill her," Jake said, abandoning his position and moving toward the mine entrance. "Jake, stay in position." Sarah's voice was urgent. "The explosions will happen with or without me. That agent has a family just like we do." Jake sprinted across open ground, knowing he was exposing himself, but unable to watch an innocent person die. His grandfather's voice echoed in his memory. "Sometimes a man has to do what's right, even when it's dangerous." He reached the mine entrance just as Vega raised her hand to signal the execution. Jake's rifle shot echoed across the hillside, and one of the guards surrounding Agent Walsh spun and fell. The FBI agent dove for cover behind a rusted mining cart as gunfire erupted from multiple directions. "Down! Federal agent!" Walsh shouted, drawing her sidearm. "Everyone down now!" The explosions Jake had planted chose that moment to detonate. The ground shook violently as tunnel sections collapsed, trapping several of Vega's men underground and sending clouds of dust and debris into the air. Emergency sirens began wailing as the mine's old warning systems activated. In the chaos, Sarah emerged from the processing building with Martinez, who was injured but mobile. Ellen's rifle cracked repeatedly from her concealed position, covering fire as they moved toward the equipment tunnel. "This way!" Jake shouted to Agent Walsh, who was pinned down by gunfire from the mine entrance. Walsh sprinted toward him, bullets chipping rocks around her feet. "How many hostiles?" "2. Many. We need to get underground." Jake led the agent toward the equipment tunnel where Ellen was waiting. Behind them, Vega's organization was collapsing into chaos as explosions continued to rock the mine complex. Several buildings were on fire, and the main shaft had partially collapsed, trapping vehicles and personnel. Eduardo, Sarah's voice, called from the tunnel entrance. She and Martinez were helping each other through the narrow passage, both injured but alive. "I'm fine, Mija," Martinez replied, though his voice was weak. "Just get us out of here." Ellen led them through passages that were now much more dangerous than when they'd entered. The explosions had destabilized sections of the tunnel system, and water was beginning to flood lower areas as underground pipes ruptured. "Who are you people?" Agent Walsh demanded as they navigated the collapsing tunnels. "Sarah Mitchell," Sarah replied. "I'm the one who downloaded the files your people have been looking for." Walsh stopped moving. "Sarah Mitchell died 10 years ago. Reports of my death were greatly exaggerated. I'll explain everything once we're clear of this place." They emerged from the tunnel system half a mile from the mine, where the sounds of battle were gradually subsiding. Jake could see helicopters approaching from the south, either reinforcements for Vega or additional federal agents responding to the firefight. "Those are ours," Agent Walsh said, spotting the aircraft. "FBI and DEA, we've been building a case against this organization for 2 years. Sarah pulled out the encrypted drives containing the stolen data. Then you're going to want these, complete. Financial records, operational plans, personnel files, and evidence of corruption involving dozens of officials." Agent Walsh accepted the drives with something approaching reverence. "Do you realize what you've done? This information could dismantle drug operations across 6 states. "That was the plan," Martinez said weakly. He was leaning heavily against Ellen, who supported him with the strength of someone accustomed to hard work. "My daughter has been planning this for years." "Your daughter? It's complicated," Sarah said. "But yes, Eduardo is my biological father. Bill Mitchell raised me, but Eduardo saved my life." The helicopters were landing now, disgorging federal agents who immediately began securing the area around the mine. Jake could see body bags being loaded into ambulances, casualties from the firefight that had finally ended Vega's reign of terror. "Amanda Vega?" Agent Walsh asked into her radio. "Confirmed deceased," came the reply. "Killed in the tunnel collapse. We're still searching for survivors, but it looks like the leadership is eliminated." Jake felt a complex mixture of relief and sorrow. The immediate threat was over, but the cost had been enormous. An entire criminal organization destroyed, dozens of people dead, and communities across Montana that would need years to recover from the corruption. "What happens now?" Ellen asked. Agent Walsh looked at the 4 unlikely allies who had somehow managed to accomplish what federal law enforcement had been attempting for years. "Now, we begin the largest RICO prosecution in Montana history. We'll need your testimony, all of you. But given what you've been through, I think we can arrange for protective custody and relocation if necessary." Sarah shook her head. "I'm tired of running. I'm tired of being someone I'm not. If there's going to be a trial, I want to face it as Sarah Mitchell." Jake looked at the woman he'd loved, lost and found again under circumstances he could never have imagined. She was different now, harder, more experienced, marked by years of survival in a dangerous world. But she was also the same person who dreamed of raising children on a Montana ranch, who'd believed in justice and truth, even when it cost her everything. "The Double M Ranch is still there," Jake said quietly. "Still needs someone to help rebuild." "It?" Sarah smiled, the first genuinely happy expression he'd seen from her since their reunion. "Are you offering me a job, Mr. Morrison?" "I'm offering you a life, Miss Mitchell. Same offer I made 10 years ago, if you're still interested." Martinez chuckled despite his injuries. "I told you she'd find her way back to you eventually. Some things are meant to be." 6 months later, Jake stood on the porch of the rebuilt ranch house watching Sarah work with the new cattle they'd purchased with insurance money and federal compensation. Rex had grown into a fine cattle dog under her patient training, and the Double M Ranch was prospering again. The trials had been everything Agent Walsh promised: extensive, complex, and ultimately successful. Dozens of criminals were convicted, corrupt officials were removed from office, and the drug pipeline through rural Montana was permanently severed. Sarah's testimony had been crucial, but she'd faced it all with the courage that had kept her alive for 10 years. Willow Creek was slowly healing. New businesses were opening, honest politicians were being elected, and families like the Hendersons and Lawsons were finally free from the criminal debts that had trapped them. It would take time to fully recover, but the community was rebuilding on a foundation of truth rather than corruption. Ellen had moved to a smaller house in town, closer to her daughter and the man who'd become the son-in-law she'd thought she'd lost forever. Martinez had accepted a position as a federal consultant, helping other law enforcement agencies identify and dismantle similar criminal operations across the Southwest. "Beautiful evening," Sarah said, joining Jake on the porch after finishing. "Her work with the cattle. Beautiful woman," Jake replied, pulling her close. She laughed, the same laugh he'd fallen in love with 20 years ago. "Flattery will get you everywhere, Mr. Morrison." "I'm counting on it, Mrs. Morrison." The wedding had been small, held in the Willow Creek Baptist Church with the entire community in attendance. It was the celebration they'd been denied 10 years earlier, but somehow made more meaningful by everything they'd endured to reach it. As the sun set over the crazy mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and purple, Jake reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. A burning barn, a woman who was supposed to be dead, and a conspiracy that threatened everything they held dear. But they'd survived it all, and in surviving, they'd discovered that some bonds are strong enough to endure any trial. Love, family, community, these were the things worth fighting for, worth risking everything to protect. Rex barked happily as he herded the cattle toward the barn, the new barn Jake had built with his own hands, stronger and better than the one that had burned. Life on the Double M Ranch was good again, and the future stretched ahead, full of promise and possibility. In the distance, the lights of Willow Creek began to twinkle in the gathering darkness. A community reborn, a family reunited, and a love story that had survived a decade of separation to find its happy ending at last. The rancher had saved the girl from the burning barn, never knowing she was his bride from 10 years ago. But in saving her, he'd also saved himself, his community, and the way of life they all treasured. Some rescues, Jake realized, work both ways. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.